The truth. I've looked for it my whole life. I want the truth to guide every part of my life, every area of my life, in every situation of my life. And that's the way it should be. But what happens when the truth is under attack? What happens when we lose the truth in entertainment, in communication, in theology, in government, in politics, in every area of life? I'm John Christopher Collins. Join me as we search for the truth in every area of life, every industry, every discipline, every study, and as we ask the question, what is the truth? Welcome to the What is Truth? W.I.T podcast. On this episode, I sit down with communications professional Dr. Mark Kelton to discuss truth in communication, why truth is important in communication, and how to respond to deception. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy this episode. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for another episode of W.I.T, or What is Truth? That's the name of this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on this third edition of the podcast. It is the 19th of February. That's hard to believe. Wednesday, 2020. You know, the first two episodes have so well laid a foundation for this episode. As you can tell in our intro and then the things we've discussed, the goal is to discern truth in different areas of life, different disciplines, academics, you name it. We want to discern truth in those areas. Well, today's topic is communication. I am a communications major. I'm a double major in journalism and government, multimedia journalism. And as you might imagine, because I'm a communications major, I know quite a few communications professors. One of them, really the staple of the communications department, in my opinion, is Dr. Mark Kelton. Dr. Kelton, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you, JC.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this day. This is a great episode. You guys are in for a treat because really what we do in communication is important. Everybody communicates. Everybody talks. Everybody listens to one another. At least we hope we're listening. So I want to get into the topic at hand on communication, but before we do, I want listeners to learn a little bit about you. So what is your position here at Evangel University?
I am Professor of Communication Studies.
Wow, that's very prestigious.
Yes. Well, don't let the title fool you.
Now, in that, you mentioned the title. What does your position, what does that title entail?
Well, my primary teaching area is in Communication Studies, which basically means I am not the tech person in the department, as some of my students already can attest to. But I teach mainly in the more application type of classes relating to theory. Like I teach mass communication theory, I teach communication theory and research, so those kinds of classes. Also, I teach a lot of performance-based classes, speech-related, like public speaking and rhetoric, effective communication, which is speaking and writing. Right now I'm teaching oral interpretation of literature, which is a performance-based class with a lot of the theater students.
Right.
And so those are my areas, theory, and then performance.
Now, you did study theater for a time, didn't you?
I did, yes. I was a minor. I was a student here at Evangel, and I minored in what was at the time called drama, now called theater, and might have been a major, at least a double major if they'd had a major. Wow. Actually, in graduate school, I was a double major, communications and drama. Okay. Wow. So in that, we're going to get to your favorite classes here, but how long have you worked here? Well, although I look like I'm a very young man, actually I'm in my 35th year here at Evangel, which is really hard to believe.
Wow.
Seeing a lot, it's hard to believe.
And you didn't plan on that, did you?
No, actually I came here, I had my speech teacher, my forensics coach, was experiencing some health issues, and she was facing like a hospital stay, this kind of thing, so she was needing help with someone to help with her classes. Primarily at that time we had a lot of fundamentals of speech labs, And so she, was trying to find someone to help out with that, and somehow we connected, and so I came here back to Springfield, and unfortunately, within just a few months, she passed away, and so they just have kept me on for some reason.
And you never looked back.
Well, I've looked back, but I try not to too much.
We won't tell events aloud.
Yeah, right.
Now, you mentioned these classes. You mentioned how that professor needed help with some of the classes. In your time here, what is your favorite class that you have taught or currently teach?
Well, of course, all the classes you've been in, JC, I would have to say
thank
that.
you. Section 1.
Section 1, that's right. Really good memory. Well, it depends in that semester, just to be honest.
Okay.
Because I like Mass Comm because, number one, it's a class that not just comm students take, so I get to meet a lot of students from other departments. But there have been some semesters. I'm glad that semester was about over, and so it just really depends on the makeup of the students. But I do enjoy that, just because mass communication is such a vital part of all of our lives.
Yes.
I enjoy comm theory because I enjoy the discussion of the theories and seeing how students can apply those in their lives. Right now, I'm teaching oral interpretation of literature, and I'm really enjoying that. Just like I said, it's a majority of theater students, even though it's cross-listed in our department.
Okay.
But so I'm getting to meet them. Some of them I have not known really before, and just to see the talent. Oh my goodness! So I enjoy that. Like I said, that's a performance-based class. And I've always enjoyed having our speech team, our speech and debate team, forensics team. So just depends on that semester, the makeup of the classes and the students, which one's my favorite. But
it's like asking which of your kids is your favorite.
That's right. Fortunately, I have one child, so I can always answer that truthfully. But yeah, it really is. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Which one's my favorite? Just they're favorite. All of them are my favorite for different reasons.
Well, and I can understand that. And I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you listening, even if you're not a communications major or if you're not a college student, if you get a chance to take a communications course, do it. There's so many good results that come out of taking a course like that for you personally, I think for your relationships with people. I remember taking effective comm. I remember taking, more recently, electronic media performance skills. And the way that helped me to communicate better, and hopefully you can tell on this podcast, ladies and gentlemen, I don't have a very hard time doing that. But when we talk about communication, a lot of people do have a hard time communicating. That's one of the things that we touch on in classes like interpersonal communication. When we talk about the elements of communication like we did in Intro to Mass Comm, it's very important that we understand that there's a sender, a receiver. You can have some interruption into that message. I don't think I've got that term quite right, so you'll have to forgive me.
No, you're doing a great job. I'm very impressed.
I could probably teach a class, but
hey. Maybe you will one day.
Maybe. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But when we talk about communication, so many people, and I think myself included at one point, we don't really pay attention to the elements in communication and how intricate it really is. We communicate whether we say something or whether we say nothing, how we look, how we feel maybe. We communicate through everything, what we do, what we don't do. Dr. Kelton knows all of this, but this is just for my benefit to set the stage here. When we talk about communication, I guess my point is, I don't think many of us know what communication is. So can you define for us what communication is?
Well, and that's the thing. To communicate about communication can be difficult, to use words to describe what that is. We know when it's going on effectively, we could say, oh, that person's a good communicator. And we also can maybe identify that person as not. And so we know it when we see it or we hear it or we read it, but to really define it, it gets somewhat tricky because like you say, it involves so many different elements. I mean, it's simplistic because you said there's got to be a sender, receiver, they're sending the message.
Correct.
So those three elements you have to have. A sender sending a message to a receiver. So that's the basics. But interruptions you mentioned or interference, that's involved. There's the feedback. So we add those other dimensions. There's a medium, the kind of medium that we use to send that message. And so there's, those aspects. Then there's, communication could be an oral message, it could be a written message, could be nonverbal message. So, see what I'm saying? It's just so many elements involved in it. That's what makes it difficult, because there's all these different dimensions, and again, depending on the context, that's another aspect of communication. To know it's effective, we have to understand what is the context of it. So that's what makes it somewhat difficult to talk about, and also to learn how to be an effective communicators, because it involves all these all these elements that we, like you said, we don't often think about.
So in defining it, would you say that a fair nutshell definition of communication is the transference of a message?
Right, from sender to receiver.
Right.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about truth in communication, we'll get to that in just a moment. But we have to know how to truthfully communicate, I think, to effectively communicate. So before we get to what is truth and all those kinds of questions that we center on in this program, can you provide a summary of the different forms of communication along with the theories?
Okay, well, again, big question there. Well, there's intrapersonal communication, which is communication with oneself. That's basically our thoughts. There's interpersonal communication. You mentioned a moment ago, communication from one person to another person. There's group communication when you add a third person. And then there's small group, there's large group, there's mass group. There's mass communication. We can get even more technical and say there's health communication, family communication, organizational communication. So we can break it down even further with that. And as far as the different theories, there are lots of what we call interpersonal theories, like relational dialectics theory, expectancy violation theory, interpersonal deception theory, and then there's mass communication theories, there's organizational communication theories, there's gender-related theories like standpoint theory. So, but
what is standpoint theory?
Standpoint theory is it's gender related, and it comes from a feminist perspective, but it's basically talking about that a person within a group, let's say, or a community, the person who is the most disenfranchised from that group, the person who has probably the least power, is kind of off in the shadows, that according to this theory, they would have the most accurate, not necessarily the best, but the most accurate standpoint of what's going on in that community, because they can step back. They have nothing like at stake in that, so they can look back, and they can look and have more of maybe an accurate standpoint of what's going on, because they have to learn how to adapt, because they don't have the power, they don't have the social standing maybe. They have to learn how to adapt to people if they want to survive. Whereas someone who is the elite, someone who has the power, they don't have to understand the other people, because, hey, it's their ball game, so they don't have to try to understand where people are coming from. That's just in a nutshell. And so it would say in that theory that women primarily would have maybe the best standpoint. I mean, it is more complicated than that, but that's why it's a gender-related theory.
Right.
From a feminist perspective.
So what theory, if we could just kind of give a brief synopsis, would you say most applies to daily communication with people?
Oh my goodness.
Just person to person, what that looks like.
I would say, especially if you're talking about relationships and deepening relationships, which is a goal that we have with communication, would probably social penetration theory. That's involving self-disclosure. And so it's trying to understand when we self-disclose, how quickly, how much, and the analogy is that of an onion that we talk about even like in interpersonal communication, where an onion, that the outer shell of an onion is, has that flaky stuff, that comes off real easily. That's that easy stuff, like, oh, what's your name, what's your major, where are you from, tell me about your family.
Right.
To where you get to the core of the onion, where you have to take a knife and really, cut into that, would be, what are your dreams in life, what's your, religious beliefs, political thoughts, that kind of stuff. That's more personal and deep within you. So anyway, I would say that one comes to mind quickly as far as developing relationships and using communication to do that.
Thank you for that. And the reason I have Dr. Kelton provide that for us, ladies and gentlemen, is to say this. I remember when I was sitting in a class on interpersonal communication, we talked about how communicators for the last several years have tried to make communication more of a science and getting analysis, getting studies. A lot of people don't think about communication in that way. But when you break it down and you realize we have so many different theories on how people interact. For instance, I don't think you have to be a professional communicator to know that the way that you interact with your boss is different than how you communicate with your wife or your children, friends, family. So we all have differences. I don't want to say personas, but differences in how we communicate with one person versus another, or one group versus another. We can see this in the news. We can see it in politics. We can see it in the sharing of the gospel. I think we can see it in every area of life. So getting to the core of the program here, we talk about what is truth. We've seen this through the lens of a philosopher, a theologian, and now a professional communicator. Dr. Kelton, in your opinion, what is truth?
Oh my goodness. I thought I was coming here to talk about my hobbies. Boy, what is truth? Well, I can give you the real spiritual answer. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, the life. So ultimately all truth reflects back to him. But from a communication perspective, I tell you, that also gets tricky. And I know I keep saying that there's, oh my goodness, you have to peel back the layers and that kind of thing. But like I mentioned a moment ago about interpersonal deception theory, that's a good example of sometimes you could have you can make a factual statement, but it's not ultimately the truth, especially if you have deception. Intentionally you have brought deception to that. Like you could ask me a question about, like students. They'll say, oh, I'm sick, I can't do that speech. Okay, well that's accurate, that's factual, but the truth is they have waited they could have, they haven't been working on the speech at all. So yes, the fact they've got a little sniffle and a cold, that is a factual statement. But is that the truth? That's not the main reason why they're not giving the speech, is because they haven't prepared. So those are those aspects of it. Like I can say something to you that's factual, but it may not be the truth because I'm not giving you the whole story. I could just outright lie and say, hey, what do you think of this outfit? Oh, I love it. And I think it looks terrible on you or whatever. Or I can sort of dodge it and saying, well, how creative. I love that, the creativity. What does that exactly mean? It's creative. I may think it's really out of, just really wacko or something. So getting to what's the truth, that is the tricky thing, because it's dealing with being factual, being honest, being forthright, and yet we do have to, and our society tells us, we do have to try to be accommodating to people, not hurt feelings, that kind of thing. So, boy, you have to balance that all out, Because you may say, be gut level honest with me, Dr. Kelton. Do you think I'm really doing the right thing here? Do you think I should take this next step or whatever? And I may say, I think you're just really off track. Like, I'm really worried about you, Okay. Of course, I'm giving you my perspective and my perception, which we study in communication. Perception is that. It's your perception. It may not be what is the actual thing, what's the actual truth, but it's my perception of what the truth is. So I can only give you what I'm thinking, But then, it may be something, like, again, what are you wearing? Like, is that a life or death thing?
Right.
And so I don't want to hurt your feelings. So I may say, yeah, that looks sharp or whatever, kind of thing. Because I'm wanting to promote the relationship, I'm wanting to keep that healthy. That's what's needed at that moment, or to build your self-esteem. What's not needed at that moment is to give you my detailed thoughts on fashion, kind of thing. So I don't know if that's making sense to you.
No, it makes perfect
sense. But that's where it gets tricky in communication. There's so many facets. Now, there's the truth. There is truth, but it's like I'm giving you my perception of the truth.
Right.
I can only do that.
Right. And that happens every day in communication, all the time. Now, the theory that you mentioned, you said, what was it?
Interpersonal deception.
Okay. Could you give a brief definition of that?
Yes, and it's one of my favorites, but it's talking about, it really gets into ethical dimensions, which of course, in our Christian faith, that's what we should talk about. It's really getting into intent. And again, that's where it gets tricky. What is, like a parent asks a child, well, where were you last night? You got in late. Oh, Eric and I were studying and time just got away. Well, yeah, you studied the first hour, but really then you had a party for the next 2 hours. So you're withholding information. Mm-hmm. What you shared was accurate, but again, you're intentionally trying to deceive your parents. You're trying to send them down a different track, a different trail. So that's where you look at. If you say this, they're going to take trail A and not B. B is what's accurate in the truth. But you're taking to A, even though you didn't lie, but you withheld information. Okay, or you skew the information, or you can intentionally just say, oh, I was studying, and you know more study than anything. So that's a downright lie. All right, but deception is you're manipulating it for your purposes, and, which you get into the whole thing of like the spies that went into Jericho, and Rahab said, oh, they have gone off into the hills, and maybe you can catch them if you leave now, kind of thing. And she was hiding them just right over there, real nearby. Corrie ten Boom during World War II, and they would hide the Jews in their home. And her sister, she had a hard time with that. She just said, I cannot lie. Like, if they ask me directly, are you hiding Jews? I'm going to have to say yes. So they just always prayed that they wouldn't ask her, because Corrie would say, she would just say no, because she felt the higher goal was to protect someone, and that that the Lord would understand, even though she was being deceitful in that situation. The higher good was to keep people alive and not, say what was the accurate, thing. So you're getting into a lot of philosophical things there,
yes.
JC.
And it's very interesting, I have to say, how everything overlaps. You've got communication, you've got sometimes psychology, philosophy. It's very, very interesting how it all kind of intersects there. Before we move on, you got your doctoral degree in communication studies?
Actually, it was in education.
Education.
From University of Missouri, right.
Okay.
So, which involved my dissertation was on communication style, and I looked at presidential leadership of colleges. So that was also focused leadership and that kind of thing. So it was a study of communication style, power in communication, and leadership. So very interesting.
And there is such a technique in communication as power moves, isn't there?
Oh, yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was kind of that area that you were going for.
Right, yeah. Using your communication to assert power over others, or to get people to cooperate with your leadership, and so how you use your communication. So very interesting. Like this coercive power, where I force you, you've got to do this, or I will fire you, or you'll get an F on that paper, or whatever. So coercive, like there's a threat involved, versus when I'm trying to motivate you, to do your best, to do it just because it would be the best thing for you to do it. There's maybe something in it for you, kind of thing, or just sort of that servant leadership. Hey, I'm willing to get dirty myself and complete the task, kind of thing. So.
And I want to say up front, for people that might not be familiar with communication techniques and styles, any talk of deceptive communication in this program is not promoting that. In fact, we often talk in communication about how there's a difference between being persuasive and being manipulative. Mm-hmm. So there is a difference. I want to say that up front, so we're not promoting any sort of coercion here. But moving on to the next question. When we talk about truth and we've talked about communication, we've laid a foundation for both of those concepts, both of those studies, if you will. Why is truth important when it comes to communication? I think the obvious answer is it helps to build relationships, but then it gets complicated when we say things like what you just said. If somebody says, does this outfit look good on me, and it doesn't, do we really want to say, that actually doesn't look very good, you probably need to go change? We don't want to be that honest, But we do know that truth is important when it comes to communication. So in what sense is it important and why?
Well, and like in that instance, you always look at what am I really being asked? Like and that's where, again, your perception comes in. Like, you're asking me that. So we have the relationship where I know you're really wanting my gut level opinion and you don't want to be embarrassed or whatever, like, hey, this looks terrible. And so I look at what's being asked. If you're asking for positive strokes, then that's how I respond. That's being the truthful thing. What you're asking me, then I give that what you're asking me. But then again, it takes discernment. It takes relationship to know, do we have that kind of relationship where I can say just what I'm really thinking, kind of thing. And sometimes that's risky because that's how relationships grow. You go to the next level where you're honest with one another, or you pour out your soul. And so, but you don't do that with everyone. Like, I remember
that would be weird.
That would be weird because it's not number one. Our culture doesn't always want that. I remember I had a student. He was from another country, and he was always very bothered. We have that's really more of a greeting. How are you? Okay. What they're just greeting you, and you're just hi, fine. How are you? Like you see them in the hallway. You're not. But so when people would say, hey, how are you? People were meant to see what the meaning was. It's a greeting. He took it literally, and so he would stop. And when he was offended, when people just kept on walking, because he thought they really wanted to know how he was doing. Well, I'm having a bad day or whatever. And so he just thought Americans were just so rude because we're asking a question, but we're not really stopping to get the answer. So again, he just didn't understand the social cues there, or cultural cues, I should say. That when people were saying, how are you, they meant it as a greeting, not they really wanted to know, how are you, tell us about your recent cancer scare or whatever, And so... Again, you need to just discern what am I being asked, and then I need to give what's being asked, and that would be being truthful in that particular. So you have to understand relationship and context. Those are two key things to know really what am I being asked, and then make sure I'm responding in that way. Because again, that's, as I said, how relationships go to the next level. Because more and more I'm being open, honest, truthful about what I'm thinking, feeling, and that kind of thing.
So really, the importance of truth in communication is to grow a relationship.
Well, I hope that would be the ultimate goal.
Yes.
Right. And of course, you can't be everybody's best buddy. You have just acquaintances, you have friends, you have best friends, you have the best friend. Like very few we'd have in a lifetime that we just can just talk about anything, and we haven't seen them in a while, and then the next time we see him, we just feel like we can take off where we left off, pick up where we left off, kind of thing. So, but yeah, God's created us to be social creatures, and He's given us the ability to communicate, and so that's wonderful and scary, and sometimes disastrous because we're not always good at it. It takes a lifetime to develop.
It's a skill, isn't it?
It's a skill, and I'm still at my young age. I'm still learning, and I hope I'm always learning to the very end.
I really think you can never learn too much about anything, but especially communication. Like I've said, it's so intricate and involved, and it touches every part of our lives, from this conversation here to what we listen to on the radio or a podcast, what we watch on TV, what we hear on Sundays at church, whatever it may be, it touches every part of our lives. And I emphasize that to show people it's really important that we get this as right as we possibly can. We're not going to be perfect. We're not going to know everything. But it is important, I think, to utilize communication as well as we can in the situation that we're in, too, like you said, with the context and things of that nature. So moving on from there, as I mentioned, we're not promoting deception or manipulation, but this has to be talked about in terms of how we as everyday people should respond. So I've got to ask you, Dr. Kelton, how should people respond to deceptive or manipulative communication?
Well, first of all, recognize that is what's happening, because at the moment we may not, when we're being manipulated, when we're being deceived, but sometimes it's calling the person out, like, hey, that's not right, that's not accurate. Now, we got to be careful that we're not saying, hey, you're lying to me, kind of thing, because that's placing a judgment, which they could be. That could be their intention. They could just be inaccurate. So, got to be careful that what we're labeling it is the truth. And so sometimes it's just asking more questions or saying, hey, that can't be right. And helping them to say, hey, you're being deceptive here. But especially with manipulation is just acknowledging that, hey, this, I'm not going to go along with that guilt trip kind of thing. But often people, unfortunately, don't realize right at the moment they're being manipulated. Later on, they'll reflect and say, whoa, I did that because they were manipulating me. Like I've seen it, unfortunately, sometimes even in the church, during sermons or in our chapel services. You can get people to do almost anything, if they're cooperative. But like I've witnessed where, people are wanting a response, people to come forward. And instead of letting the Spirit guide or direct people, they're being manipulative. Like, they're making this appeal or that appeal, or it's, making it strongly emotional or something, where people are responding to that and not, hey, I need to go forward for prayer or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I've been in those situations where it's like, wow, this is just manipulation. And here's the thing, when people realize that, they may not at the moment, but later, they will be so against what you were trying to get them to do. Like, I'll never do that for that person because they were just manipulating me. Or they will be against the gospel or something, which we would never want that. No. So we got to be careful how we're delivering the message, because again, if there's manipulation or deception involved, and again, they may not know it right at the moment, but the person, when they do, it will be negative toward you. So you've got to be careful that you're not doing that intentionally, or even if you didn't mean to do it and it happened, going back to the person and say, you know what, I shouldn't have put that pressure on you, and I really apologize for that, or I didn't mean for it to come out that way, and just being honest. And sometimes, like I said, calling out people, especially if it's people you know well, where you could just say, hey, JC, what are you doing? Come on now, don't play that card,
right?
Kind of thing. And sometimes in relationships, somebody might have the power at the moment because maybe you blew it with them and you did something, or maybe you did lie to them. And so they'll come back with you, well, are you lying now? And, try to put the guilt trip on you. And you could say, okay, listen, we were talking about A, and now you've brought up B. Okay, if you want to talk about B, okay, but let's not mix the two. They don't relate. Wow. And so if you want to talk about B, I told you I would always be honest with you, and so I goofed up that time, I admit it. If you want to talk about B, let's talk about it. But, come on now, JC, it has nothing to do with A. Wow. So we're either going to talk about A or B, not mix them together.
When we talk about that again, I think, like you said, it's so crucial in our relationships, and especially, I didn't even think about it, but with the gospel, to not give people reason to question our message. And I think one of the things we talked about, ladies and gentlemen, in my effective communications class is ethos, pathos, and logos. So when you talked about emotion, that's pathos. Ethos is the credibility of the person that you're listening to. And then we have logos. It's the logical, factual appeal to things. How does this person sound logically? So again, when I say communication is complex, it's complex.
Yeah, and I'm so impressed you remember that. You don't even have notes in front of you. But yeah, for that, of course, we get that borrow that from Aristotle. Again, all truth's God's truth, no matter where we find it. And Aristotle would say all three of those dimensions have to be present, but we have to determine which one is important at the moment. Emphasize that. Like if people could care less, then we might need them to care. And so we might bring in the emotional element. And if they're kind of on the fence or they're not sure, then we hit them hard with those arguments. And we try to push them onto our side. So we don't bring up emotion and all that. We just give them the arguments. Or maybe they're going to have trouble with us as the messenger. Like our credibility is weak. They don't know us, or they don't feel like we are able to talk about that subject. So we have to beef up our ethos, as you said. So yeah, it's not just hey, it's a persuasive message. It has all those elements in there. Like you said, that's what makes it complex. That should be simple, but it's really not. Right.
No, it's not. And I don't think, even in our learning, like you said, we never stop learning. I say unfortunately, I guess it's good that we never stop learning, because then we wouldn't have anything to learn. But sometimes I know people can get so frustrated because they're like, I think I'm communicating well, but this person just doesn't get what I'm trying to say.
I know.
And it can be so frustrating. As somebody that, I think I'm good at communicating. I'm sure you think you're good at communicating. We're communicators. And when you think that you're good at something and it's not coming out as well as you would like, it's very frustrating. One of the great crossovers with my two disciplines, journalism and government, is the fact that I have a great interest in investigative journalism. So when we talk about deception, that can get a little dicey when we're looking at government, when we're looking at what do the people really need to know. And when you're talking about making a judgment call and not to accuse somebody, what I've had to learn in journalism is that it's my job to get the facts together and to report it. The people, the public, will make the judgment call. And then eventually, if it leads to something, the law will make the judgment call. I'm not the one that puts out the judgment on the elected officials. I just report the story. But it's very interesting when you look at, okay, what's the crossover here? Is deception always wrong? Well, if you look in the Bible, like you said, there's some cases where it's used to protect other people. You could make the argument that, yeah, sometimes deception is needed in a government sense. Do people like that? Not really. And we start to question the ethos of government.
Right. Yeah, like you don't want to, the enemy, hey, where are you going to send the missiles? Oh, here, we'll tell you. There's some things you got to keep. That's where some of these not whistleblowers necessarily, but people, Snowden and stuff, who revealed these, things, which, some things need to be revealed, but when you're talking about government, things dealing with the war and all that, where, lives should be protected, that's where it gets really complicated there.
Yes.
There's some things people say, well, that needs to be hidden because, it's protecting, but really it's protecting maybe someone's career, political career, not necessarily it's protecting lives or whatever, so that's where it gets tricky.
Yes, it's, like I said, a very dicey process, and most investigative stories can take months or years to complete. So now that we have that establishment of it's not as easy to grasp when this is necessary, when it's not, when we should object to it, the next train of thought that I hop onto immediately is what's lacking in communication today between people, and how should we go about fixing it? If we have this problem, like I said, when we look at our government, and people are less trusting than they used to be, or whatever it may be, the media, for instance, is a good topic. There are polls out that say people are less trusting, and some people could pin that on the president, some people could pin that on the Times, whatever it may be. How do we go about aiding our communication with people? What is lacking that you have seen as a communications professional?
Well, I can easily tell you what's lacking. Now, I'm not sure if I can easily say what's the solution, because we're talking about people, but it's definitely listening to one another. Because we think of communication, it's always sender to receiver, and I'm sending my message and all that, but it's also the receiver giving feedback, and so then they become the sender. And sometimes we're so set in our view that interruption you were calling it a moment ago, that interference noise is another term we use, that internal noise is so strong that I'm giving you my view, JC, and whatever, and then you're saying something back, and I'm not really listening to you. There's all that noise because I'm trying to get my next argument to you, and I'm going to make sure mine's better than yours, kind of thing, and I'm not really trying to see where you're, coming from. And like we see that today with the political divide. My goodness, I'm embarrassed, what we're communicating to your generation and then those younger than you. It's like, it's I've never seen it this bad. It's been bad, believe me, all my life. But I can remember, President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, they were so different in their political views, and they would get into conflicts. But at the end of the day, they would, a lot of those people in the Senate and the House, they would fight it out that day, but then at night they'd go to have dinner together and that kind of stuff. We just don't see that anymore, and it's again because we're so wanting to get our point across. We're not listening to the other person, and we're talking about heavy duty issues like sensitive things like maybe abortion or things like that. And I remember having a conversation with someone one time, and And it just really hit me like, okay, they had a view against mine. I'm pro-life, and they were, first of all, I was like, this person's not evil that believes, like pro-choice,
right?
And that they were, and they said like, I would personally never have an abortion. I would think that's morally wrong, but my issue is the government saying that, getting involved with this whole process, which again, we're not here to debate all that issue, but it was like, I saw something in a perspective that I just, kind of, brushed everyone's all the same and but it's like when I kind of heard their heart, that it's like, look, I think this is wrong, but my issue is about how the government should step in. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Like, okay, I'm glad to see, your view, like, you don't believe in it, like, you think it's morally wrong, but the issue of government, okay, let's talk about that, Right. And then we could talk about, well, sometimes the government gets involved with things like people wearing their seatbelts and, stuff, and so we're trying to protect people, even though, freedoms and all, so we can start at least a discussion, but sometimes when we're just like, okay, you believe this, or this is your view, then you must be like this, and then you just whitewash everyone the same, or you stereotype everybody, and that's, of course, I'm talking about, that's some heavy issues, but just even in everyday conversation, that we're not listening, we're arguing in our mind, and we're not really letting the person communicate back to us and trying to really see the perspective. It's like, if we would do what Jesus said, we would have no war, everybody would get along, do unto others. Like, when I'm speaking to you, I don't want you not listening or just thinking your thoughts and like, how am I going to give a rebuttal back to him? I want you to really listen to me and see where I'm coming from, and try to understand me, not judge what my intention is, but really try to see where I'm coming from. Don't go to the worst case scenario. Start with at least the best until I prove to you that I really am giving you the worst situation. So I think that if we would just really listen, especially as believers, we should be the best listeners. And sometimes we're the world's worst. We don't even study the issue. We're haphazard in our responses. We just whitewash everyone's the same. And I'm stereotyping here, but if we should be the best. People should say, man, those Christians, I think some of them are nut jobs or whatever, and I sure don't agree with them, but you know what? I just can't argue with the way they approach or the way they're responding to me. I just really appreciate that, and so, but I don't think that's often what they say.
No, unfortunately, I don't believe it is. No. When we look at communication, again, we've established how complex it is. Unfortunately, it's so complex that even 5 podcasts on this topic wouldn't do it justice. There's so much to unpack. But when we talk about the media, they are a big purveyor of communication. We talk about the 8 different types of mass media. There's 8 of them, ladies and gentlemen, in case you didn't know. And yes, books are included in that. So often when people think of mass media, they think of TV, radio, newspapers. But it's broader than that. So with that up front, and we're talking about the mass media in this instance, I want to kind of give an encapsulating view of all of it, all of the 8 mass media, but specifically the news media. When we talk about, as I said, maybe a distrust factor, what are your thoughts on the current relationship with the mass media and its audience?
Well, you're right. There is some distrust there, and then sometimes there's the opposite where, oh, it's out there, it must be true. It's on my social media feed or whatever. Oh, please, no. I mean, anyone can tweet anything and can put anything out there. Doesn't mean it's true at all. We have to be very discerning consumers. Where is the source coming from? Even if it's from our favorite political party or the station we always listen to or watch or whatever. It's like, let's be diligent and check the facts. Get to what's accurate, what's the truth, instead of just accepting it hook, line, and sinker kind of thing. And so I think there's extremes. Don't trust at all, and then just, well, whatever whatever it is. Also, what's passing today as news is really analysis. Okay, it's not, this is the news, commentary. I'm reporting. Yeah, it's commentary. But they'll say, we're the so-and-so news network. Well, it's an which, nothing wrong with that, but call it what it is. So I know I'm getting your interpretation of the news, your analysis of it, your commentary on it, not what, this is just, I'm reporting the facts of the news. Right. This event happened, this is that. you're really giving me analysis, which is fine, but let's call it what it is. So I think that's some of it. What's passing is news.
Let's be truthful.
Yeah, you can say, hello. That sounds novel. Yeah.
So, do you think, and like you said, it has been bad before. Mm-hmm. Things have been bad. Mm-hmm. This is nothing new.
No.
But do you think in some sense that the audience's relationship to the media is worse than it's ever been? Or do you think it has been worse or it could be worse?
Well, then we're getting to that thing about communication, JC, and words. It's relative, like what's worse, I mean, I think the respect factor has definitely gone down, and some of it's been because we've had journalists who've been untruthful and have been dishonest and have not reported things accurately, and so, and then again, you have certain like networks or whatever that again get labeled, oh, this one's conservative, this one's liberal, or blah blah blah, and so we just immediately, I'm not gonna, if that's not my view, then I'm not going to listen to whatever they say. It's got to be wrong. Instead of like, whoa, they're really challenging me to think about. Okay, I need to be thinking of this. Is this something I need to check out? But if I just dismiss them right away, then I'm never going to be challenged or grow or that kind of thing. So, yes, I would say there are things, that are not good. They've been better, and some of it's because now we have a plethora. Anybody and their grandma can now have a voice, which in some ways is good. But there's so many voices now. It used to be like the big three, like networks, NBC, CBS, ABC, and now it's like no, not even. What's even traditional television now is so different. And radio, it's going through a lot of change, and now like you have here podcast and things like that. So there's different ways of getting the message out. But now there's so many pieces of the pie. It's like so many voices. So who do I trust? Believe?
I know a lot of people, especially in my generation, have told me, well, I get my news and my updates about current events from late night shows. Mm-hmm. And I remember hearing that, and I'm like, what? So it's very interesting how that changes and what we decide to trust, what we don't trust. And it's a pendulum. It goes back and forth.
Oh, it does.
It's very, very interesting. Final question as we wrap up here. What would you advocate that the people, the audience, individuals, or the media do to promote better, more constructive, and more truthful communication with each other? You mentioned listening, but is there anything else in your mind that's important?
Well, again, developing skills of persuasion, argument, where we, again, check facts, we present them in a logical way, and say, hey, here, we're giving this information, now it's up to you to check us out and see that we're accurate. And instead of like it's, you're just like, no, wait a minute, that's still their view or whatever, which again, are we going to be totally bias free? I don't know if you can be. But you can make good strides in making it as balanced as you can. And so if you can just demonstrate, hey, this is reason, this is supported by evidence, here's my argument, or here's the factual story or whatever you happen to give, here's the details, here's this side, here's that side, if you could just do things with excellence, I think you can win the trust back, and I think there would be more communication. And again, not prejudging, saying, oh, they've got a motive. Maybe they do. But again, it's acknowledging that, maybe calling that out, where you say, okay, well, you said this, but here's what I found out. How do you account for this? So holding people accountable.
Dr. Kelton, thank you. This has been a treat.
Well, thank you, JC. Enjoyed it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to this episode. We've got one more coming up with Dr. Robert Bartels here at Evangel University. Very excited for that. Dr. Kelton, thanks again. Ladies and gentlemen, if you see him around campus or off campus, wherever you may be, tell him how much you enjoyed this episode. And learn to communicate. Communicate with Dr. Kelton. He's pretty cool. Until next time, search for the truth. Thank you for listening to the What is Truth WIT podcast with myself and Dr. Mark Kelton. You've just heard about the theories of communication, the different kinds of communication, how communication works, and how to respond to deception. Join me next time as we sit down with Dr. Robert Bartels of Evangel University.